Think about this for a second. For more than 2 decades, the United States has poured just an absolutely staggering amount of military, political, and economic resources into the Middle East. It wasn't just a series of events, it was a monumental shift in global doctrine that literally defined an entire generation. And, it really brings us to one massive overarching question. How did these incredibly complex conflicts fundamentally change both the Middle East and the United States itself? Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer on the $1 trillion wars. Today, we're going to unpack the monumental resources committed to Iraq, Libya, and the long-standing US-Iran confrontation. We're going to explore how these massive interventions fundamentally rewired global power dynamics and how they sparked these intense, ongoing debates about America's footprint as a superpower. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the War on Terror. Then we'll dive into 3 distinct case studies. That's Iraq, Libya, and Iran, before zooming out to look at the ultimate price of intervention. So part 1, the War on Terror and how it expanded way beyond counterterrorism. Right after the devastating attacks on September 11th, the initial stated goals of the global war on terror were actually pretty straightforward. It was all about eliminating immediate terrorist threats, protecting national security, and promoting regional stability. Simple enough, right? But the strategic doctrine quickly morphed. What began as a highly targeted mandate to dismantle al-Qaeda basically snowballed into ambitious, full-scale nation-building. American military involvement grew to deeply influence the internal politics, the infrastructure, and the leadership of several sovereign nations. Which brings us to part 2, Iraq, the costliest conflict, and the full-scale invasion. So the crucial point here is March 2003, when the US and its allies launched a full-scale invasion. Now, the argument at the time was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed this imminent global threat. But as we know, after the dust settled, no active stockpiles were ever found. And this wasn't just a minor miscalculation. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure that deeply damaged US credibility abroad, and it completely altered the public's trust in intelligence gathering for decades to come. And if we look at how this played out, it happened incredibly fast at first. Within mere weeks of that 2003 invasion, Saddam Hussein's government fell. It was a rapid military victory. But then, highly controversial decisions like completely disbanding the Iraqi military created this massive, gaping power vacuum. So Iraq plunged into a really dark period of fierce insurgency and just devastating sectarian violence. And years later, it was this very instability that fueled the rise of ISIS, which of course forced renewed US military operations. It perfectly shows how a swift tactical win evolved into a grueling, multi-layered security nightmare. Moving on to part 3, Libya. Intervention, instability, and a NATO-backed regime change. And this brilliantly illustrates a completely different approach. Jumping ahead to the 2011 Arab Spring, we see a strategy operating under a UN mandate, where the core goal was civilian protection. But the aftermath, well, it remains deeply polarizing. On one hand, supporters will quickly point to an averted humanitarian disaster and the successful collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's government. But critics? They contend that the total lack of a day-after stabilization plan plunged Libya into years of fractured, localized militia warfare, leaving rival armed factions fiercely competing for control over a deeply fragmented state. All right, part 4. Iran, a decades-long confrontation characterized by proxy and cold conflict. So, unlike Iraq or Libya, where we saw direct boots-on-the-ground intervention, the situation with Iran is a long-simmering cold conflict. The US and Iran have largely avoided full-scale direct war. Instead, their entire relationship is defined by severe economic sanctions, incredibly complex diplomatic disputes, and extensive proxy battles unfolding in places like Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. It is essentially an intricate, high-stakes chess game of regional influence rather than direct battlefield confrontation. Let's move to the key tension points and see how this builds up. The modern friction really traces its roots back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and it's just been compounded over the years by deep disagreements over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Plus, Iran's backing of various armed groups across the Middle East continuously fuels diplomatic fires. And all this friction reached a massive, boiling flashpoint in 2020 with the U.S. strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. That was a moment that brought the entire region to the absolute brink of direct war and really underscored just how volatile this cold conflict remains. Which finally leads us to part 5, the price of intervention, the cumulative cost. Now, what's really interesting here is this number, $8 trillion. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, that is the staggering estimated price tag of the broader post 9/11 wars. It's astronomically high, right? And that's because it doesn't just calculate the immediate cost of military operations. It actually factors in massive long-term structural obligations. We're talking decades of critical care for veterans and the heavy compounding interest on the immense capital that had to be borrowed to fund these initiatives in the first place. But look, as massive as that financial number is, we absolutely cannot let it overshadow the immense human toll. Thousands of American service members made the ultimate sacrifice, with tens of thousands more returning home wounded. And across the affected regions, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Furthermore, the sheer scale of the conflict displaced millions of individuals from their homes. It triggered cascading, widespread humanitarian crises that continue to resonate deeply to this very day. Because you see, none of this happened in a vacuum. These interventions fundamentally reshaped global perceptions of American foreign policy. They forged the very foundation of today's complex, multipolar international order. And more than 20 years later, the legacy of Iraq, Libya, and the U.S.-Iran confrontation remains a critical subject of analysis precisely because it actively drives the current geopolitical alignments and the strategic calculations we're seeing across the Middle East today. So it all leaves us with one massive, lingering question to think about. Did these decisive actions effectively address existential security threats, or did they unleash unintended consequences that will forever destabilize the international order? Some argue they were totally necessary responses to very real dangers, while others believe the resulting regional instability speaks for itself. The true long-term answer is honestly still unfolding before our eyes. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning everything, and I'll catch you next time.